everybody. Welcome to another episode of Entrepreneur Mind Speak. I'm Lauren with Creme de Mint, a branding and packaging design agency, and I'm here with my co-host, Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm the founder of a web design agency based in Tampa named Cloud Create.
And today we would love to welcome Rich Small. Thank you so much for being here, Rich.
Hi, happy to be here.
So let's talk about your background. Let's talk about your NPR. We'd love to hear more. Tell us about you.
All right, yeah. So yeah, as you said, I've been in PR for about going on 20 years actually at this point,
Oh.
but focused on the beauty and health and wellness sector for probably the 15 of those years. So it's been a good chunk of my career just being focused on beauty brands, men's grooming brands, lifestyle brands overall. And then just seeing that infusion of health and wellness along the way within beauty has been kind of part of what I've seen as we've gone and evolved from an industry standpoint. Right now, I'm the EVP of Insights Measurement and Strategy at Hunter PR. So I work across all of the teams across Hunter, and just infusing insights, measurement best practices, and just making sure we're putting forth the best strategy within all of our brands. I mainly work on the beauty, personal care, and health and wellness teams, but again, I kind of span across the agency, just as far as what I do and what my team does to make sure we're just putting forth those best practices within PR.
Amazing. And can you talk about, I know you can't disclose what brands you work on now with Hunter, but what can you name some past brands that you've worked on and past companies you've worked with?
Definitely. So my starter brand, I would say, was Gillette. So that was my first men's grooming brand. Also Venus, which was their razor for women. That's where I always say I grew up. As far as my PR career goes, I was there working on that brand for nearly 5 years. So that's why I learned so much about the industry and the basics of PR. But beyond that, I've worked on brands such as Aveeno, Neutrogena, the Art of Shaving, so some of those smaller niche brands as well. Some of the bigger brands include Axe body spray, as well as Degree for Men deodorant, and also some multicultural brands that were under Unilever at the time, including Motions, Just for Me, some of those smaller brands as well. So it's been
Oh,
a good range of brands that I worked on overall, from like big to smaller, multicultural, general market. So it's definitely given me a good experience within the industry.
It's amazing. What an amazing array of brands that you got to work with. I'm so excited to hear more. Like, I feel like PR is a very, like, everybody knows what it is, but people don't realize what really is involved in it. So I'm so excited to hear more.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes I don't know myself. Sometimes I'm like, oh my God, there's so many things we can do in PR. It's just like
Yeah.
it, especially lately where we get involved in so many things, but trying to explain it to my mom is still a challenge. But otherwise, yes.
so tell me, how has the PR industry evolved since you started your career?
Yes, which I think about this quite often because I've been doing this for such a long time and I've seen such a big evolution. When I started in the industry, it was very much just traditional PR. I think blogs were just becoming a thing. Facebook, I think, was just starting up, and that was more focused on college campuses. So when it came to PR, it was very much traditionally what you think of when you think of PR. It was talking to editors, trying to get placements within top outlets. So at the time, there may have been like 25 to 30 top long lead outlets. So the magazines that you know and love, like Vogue, Allure, some of those outlets where our teams were just literally building relationships with those editors. We'd have events, we'd send them deliveries, we'd take them out to dinners and just courted them to try to get into those publications as much as possible. That's what we did. There was also very much a separation of church and state, which meant the editors did not care about the sales piece of things. So they were just strictly writing about things that they really liked. So you had to have that face time with them. You wanted them to love you and the brand. So that's what they were writing about, was things that they truly cared about and loved. Now it's shifted to where there's more sales involved. As you've seen, the landscape is changing. Like, outlets are closing all the time now. There's few long lead physical magazines now. Most of them are online. So a lot of that is now driven by sales as well. So it's kind of changed things as far as like their preferences to, we also have to think about what's going to sell. What is it that our sales team needs? How do we infuse that into what we're including in the magazine? So that's definitely been a major shift. One thing that comes up a lot is affiliate links and how important those are when it comes to getting your products into those outlets. That's going to drive a sale for them. That leads to revenue. That's going to keep them in business. So that's one aspect that's definitely changed. The other piece is, of course, influencers. So
Influencers. I was waiting for that word.
that's the big one that you can't escape that one. So just seeing how, for me, how it started with blogs, that was kind of the first step away from just the traditional PR media model to that becoming social influencers and social media right now. That was just huge. And I think that's where you're seeing probably most brands play, even from a PR standpoint. It's now PR is also building relationships with influencers and paying them for content. So the question often becomes, like, is it still PR, which is technically supposed to be, quote, earned media versus what you pay for to get more of an ad? So there's like definitely been a lot of blurring of the lines between the two, but most PR agencies, I will say, and most PR functions are responsible for both. But there is some times where another agency, like a media buying agency or an ad agency, may fight for that responsibility for influencers, in which case PR still can play a role, but it's more about, we can still build relationships with influencers and get free content from them by building those relationships, sending them products, taking them to different experiences. So keeping to that more traditional editorial model, but applying it to influencers is one way that we make sure we're still involved in that process if we're not in charge of actually sponsoring the content to be created.
That is so interesting. And now that you're mentioning that, because I work with e-commerce brands more than anything, like so e-commerce brands, larger ones, small ones. And it's definitely like now I see that divide between the PR of the brand, especially the bigger brands, where they have a PR sector and they really care about the messaging, the value, but then it kind of slides over into marketing. And then you have the marketing agency that's setting up the influencers, and it all has to be coordinated. And this is something that I'm usually not a part of, but I often see kind of play out on the sidelines, but while I'm doing the development or whatever. So that's so interesting to hear it from your point of view. And I do love that it's kind of like almost sounds like a little bit more of a long-term strategy, like really making those relationships, like having brand ambassadors rather than just somebody that's like, oh, they just love the brand and promote it a couple times, like somebody that you can really have a relationship and can be a front for your brand. It sounds like a little bit that's where the divide is, if I'm
absolutely. And I think
yeah.
to that point, that's what we see happen quite a bit by keeping those relationships up. An influencer that you worked with a year ago might still be thinking about your brand and be doing a different type of content and decide to just include you on their own. And the
Yeah.
benefit of that is they don't have to include the ad in that case. So it comes across as super authentic, that it shows that they truly love the brand, versus when you pay for it, they have to follow the FTC guidelines. So that's another added value that we play up from a PR standpoint.
Oh my gosh, that's such a great point. That really shows the long game, the importance of the long game.
Exactly.
Awesome. And so what strategic planning tips can you offer for emerging beauty brands to gain traction in the competitive market, both in terms of PR as well as brand strategy?
I would say data is step number one for I think especially startup brands. I think that's a key part of the strategy. As you said, it's very competitive. It's super cluttered, like just the landscape, especially the beauty landscape overall. There's so many brands popping up every single week, it seems like. Then you still have like the legacy brands that are still trying to keep a place within that landscape. So there's a lot happening. So I would say one thing just to keep in mind is the data piece and understand the trends that are happening, both consumer trends and the cultural trends, and figuring out where you can play a role or tap into that makes sense for your brand. So one example I'll give is just thinking about, for instance, Google Trends. That's something that a lot of PR people don't naturally think about as a way to find out what's going on and what people are searching for. That's a big piece of our strategy, I will say, in general, when it comes to our brands. It's like, what are those Google trends? What are those other trends happening on TikTok? TikTok is where Gen Z searching. That's their Google for the most part. So
Right,
what's
yeah.
happening there that can inform our strategy, whether it's an activation or a long-term strategy. So we've been looking at those data sources quite a bit and trying to understand, even the kind of the crossover between the two. So what is the natural consumer behavior? Do they go to TikTok to search? And then from there, are they going to Google to get more information? Or is there not an association? Is it just really Gen Z on TikTok? That's all they care about, especially with TikTok's new buying function where you can actually buy things on TikTok directly. Do you ever have to leave TikTok? So we're definitely watching for those trends, but also the hashtags, the different aesthetics that happen on TikTok are huge. So like there's everything from the grandma coastal aesthetic to the strawberry girl aesthetic. That is if you look at some beauty brands, you're seeing how they're starting to create those trends in a very subtle way. So one thing I learned recently is the strawberry girl trend was started by a beauty brand. It was it,
Oh my God.
oh my gosh, was it Bella Hadid? It was, no, Hailey Bieber, I believe. So she did a partnership with a beauty brand. I can't remember the name right now. She did a partnership with the beauty brand. They started seeding the partnership by creating this strawberry aesthetic, which led to a launch of their strawberry line. So it was
Oh
a
my God.
very clear strategy when you look back at it, but at the time that you're seeing it, you don't really understand what's happening. Another good example right now is CeraVe. I don't know if you've seen what they're doing. They're working with Michael Cera.
Yes,
And everyone's
crazy.
like, what is this? What's happening? But they're tapping into this whole idea of like consumers are going for this kind of dupe mentality right now where they don't know what's real, what's not real. So it just starts this great big conversation. Like, why are they working with, why do I see him carrying like 50 containers of CeraVe? What is he doing? So you're starting to see influencers talk about it more. So the question is that do they not know? Are they in on this, or are they being sponsored to do this? What's happening? So it's driving so much conversation right now where people are already saying CeraVe is winning the skin health game right now because of this campaign.
Wow, that's so interesting because I had the same reaction. I saw that come up and I was like, this is hilarious. Like I'm like, I don't know if CeraVe is involved, but if they are, this is genius. Because you just see like
Exactly.
stickers of his face and then people are like, Michael CeraVe. Like that's so funny.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant, but they're a great example of a brand that takes risks. And it's like they're a very science
Yeah.
brand, very dermatologist focused brand, but they take risks to get people talking about them, and it works every time.
Totally. And it's so interesting because their overall branding, like I've always found them pretty plain looking, compared to all these like beautiful colors and all these new designs. And CeraVe has been essentially the same for years, but then their campaigns are just so good.
Absolutely.
How can startups effectively leverage influencer relations to build awareness and credibility for their beauty brands?
So I would start, especially when it comes to startups, it's building those relationships is going to be super important. So any brand can pay for an influencer to do a post if you have that budget, but it's that relationship, as we were saying before, that building that longer term relationship, having those multiple touch points with the influencers to show that you're trying to build the brand with them. So it's beyond just a post. It's like you want their input. So do you think about using influencers as your creative counsel? So bringing a few in to test your products, giving them that insider access to where they actually feel invested in your product without actually being investors to some extent. I think that's one way that we're seeing a lot of brands shift to, especially if it's a newer brand that may not have the huge marketing budget. That's how you get those true fans of yours because they truly like the product. I think that's a piece of it. Also thinking beyond just the general beauty influencers. So I think that's a strategy that, it could work for a startup. So what does your brand stand for? Is there a story behind your brand? What other type of people would naturally want to use your brand outside of just the beauty folks? So that could be anyone from dermatologists who are huge on social media right now. They're social influencers all on their own because of how their presence. That's part of their business at this point. They're also the people that the media go to talk to. So that's an example of someone beyond the typical beauty influencer you can work with. Could also be if you're more of a wellness brand, but still in the beauty space. Who are those wellness folks that you want to target? So is it the runner? Is it the fitness expert? There's so many niche influencers that have very engaged fans that you can tap into to like really help propel your brand overall. So I think that is definitely a huge piece of it, just maintaining those relationships, building them, getting them involved as much as possible, in addition to like obviously having samples to where we can get as much product out to them as possible to reach as many, and the typical, of course, sponsoring the content piece of it as well. I think it all kind of works together.
And I guess like, so for a new beauty brand, like how would they go about developing these type of partnerships if they don't know anybody? How would they start?
I think it would start with a good old search. So whether it's TikTok or Google, searching for like who are those top influencers within your category. So trying to get as niche as possible. So like, are you a holistic beauty brand? Are you all natural? Kind of narrowing down what you are and finding those influencers that really focus on that. I think that's one step you can take. If you have the luxury of having the budget to bring on certain tools, that helps as well. There are certain influencer tools that brands use that help them identify in an easier way. It's like a database basically of influencers. You can use certain filters to filter to what you want, whether it's follower count to what their audiences love to their engagement rates to help find those influencers as well. So I think it's that discovery piece is step number one, understanding who you want to represent your brand from an influential standpoint and how you can make that somewhat niche to start with, and then thinking of also how you can build on that. That also helps with a differentiation, just knowing there's so many beauty brands who will go out to the same type of beauty influencers. If you can get that niche group to really start talking about that brand, the idea would be they would start to grow and other people outside of that niche group will think, oh, what is that I'm hearing about? I want to try that as well. So I think that's kind of the first step you'd want to take from a strategic standpoint and getting those influencers on board.
The genuineness kind of is really a powerful element here too. Like, because obviously if someone is trying out a million creams and 100,000 are great, it's a very different from somebody who normally doesn't talk about cream, but then they're like, actually this one cream I found is specifically good for this thing that's specific to my industry or whatever. Like,
Absolutely. That's a really good example with a brand that I've worked with in the past. There was a specific cream that they were launching that was thicker than their normal creams. And we started to identify, okay, who would use this? It's like, it seems more outdoors, like it's more of an outdoor thing. Like you're going to be out in the elements where you need this thick formula. So let's identify who are those outdoor, is it the hikers? Is it mountain climbers? Is it skiers? Who are those folks we can target outside of that typical beauty space? And I think this is part of the strategy. Don't be afraid to test and learn. You can always pivot when it comes to influencers. So we actually expanded our strategy to say, we're going to work with the beauty influencers. We know you feel safe in that arena, but let's also work with a few of these folks and let's see how their results compare to the beauty influencers. And we saw the engagement rates for the other folks, right, that it was so much higher than the beauty influencers. Because to your point, they were actually they rarely talk about beauty or grooming products, but in that case they did it and they actually liked the product. They saw there was a need for it and it addressed what they needed for their outdoor lifestyle, and it worked for their audiences as well.
Wow.
amazing.
And
That's so awesome.
what, which audience was it? Was it skiers? Was it hikers? Like
It
I'm
was
like
the hiking community.
the hiking
So that,
community.
yes,
Love
because
that.
it was just because they were outdoors, they were walking, but hands are often exposed like during the winter. So, and it was mostly a hand cream overall. So that for some reason it was the hiking community that the product really resonated with, which was interesting because we didn't think that was necessarily going to be the one, but
Yeah.
it worked out.
So
But as part of that strategy, that's where we would say then we'd go back and say, let's put more money here. Let's
Yeah.
move away from this group if they're not working out. Like if it's the skiers that aren't doing, like we're not seeing the engagement there, let's put more money into this and let go some of the skis. So we're optimizing the results that we're seeing coming in.
amazing. And you mentioned a trend, like not a trend. You mentioned a tool for influencers to look that up. What are some names of some tools that people could
Their
invest in if they wanted to?
Creator IQ is one. That's one that comes to mind that I'm most familiar with. There are definitely a ton of others, but I think that's one of the more common ones that is used specifically in the PR agency, but it does exactly what I was
That's quite a
describing.
bit, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
can. Cost can get up there, but it can also be a cost efficiency if you're planning to roll out a lot of influencer work because you can do everything from contracting influencers within this tool. You can communicate with
Wow.
them through this tool. You can get price quotes. So it can, to some extent, be an all-in-one tool for influencers if that's going to be your focus.
Wow. And speaking of costs, so if you have, let's say you have kind of a startup new brand, what can they do that's kind of budget friendly? Would you send them, obviously they might not be able to hire a big PR agency yet. What would be some ways to create buzz? Would you say going after influencers, maybe using one of these tools? What are your tips to people that are just starting and they kind of want to get some traction before investing in an agency?
Oh yeah, I would say being very clear on what makes your brand or product stand out, and
Hmm.
like, having a true story, because again, you're competing with so many other startups and legacy brands. You have to have something that you truly believe is going to break through the clutter, whether it's like a brand story or a product that's just amazing. I think that's step number one. From there, you do want to start building those relationships. So identifying the influencers and even the editors that you think are going to be most important, and starting the outreach. You would never just send product directly to them without introducing yourself first. So I think it's just identify that list of folks that you want to focus on from the very beginning, doing some outreach to them as simple as an email and just saying, hey, I just love your content. I have this new product. Here's what we stand for. Are you open to receiving more information and a sample? I think that's the easiest way to start. I think a lot of people will just say yes, especially if it's a startup and you have that story. That's going to be an easy yes just to try the product. And then asking for feedback as well. I think that's where it comes in, where you can say, like, would love your honest thoughts on the product. A lot of times when you do this and take this step, they will at least do a story if they like the product for free. Just because you sent them something and built that relationship, you have like that 24-hour period for a story. I think more influencers are more okay with doing that story because it doesn't last long, and that allows them to keep moving on to the next brand if they need to. So I think that's definitely step number one. And then keeping those touch points, again, is also important. So once you've gotten that feedback, can you create another touch point with them? Depending on what stage you are, can you adjust the formula if you're getting a ton of people giving you the same feedback? Or do you just offer more products within your portfolio if you have more? And then as you're building that, that's when you can start to pivot and say, we'd love to do some sponsored content with you after you've seen them organically post. Then you can offer them that deal. They might be more open to negotiating, knowing you're a smaller brand. I think in some cases, if they hear a big brand, they're thinking more money. If it's a smaller brand and you've built that relationship, they will likely be more open to that negotiation. So I think that's going to be the best starting point. And again, the sample piece is super important. So once you met that first content and you hear that they're contacting, you hear that they're open to receiving product, making sure you have enough on hand to get it out to as many influencers as possible. That just increases your chances of getting that organic content.
Awesome. That's a great advice. I feel like that makes the whole subject of PR a lot more approachable, especially for those starting out in the space. They might not be super familiar with how to do things, but that's a really easy, it almost creates like a friendship there rather than making it, this kind of scary thing to way of approaching PR.
Exactly. And I mean, and like you said, it's very straightforward and simple, but it really works. And that works with influencers and media as well. So it's the same approach you would take for both.
Awesome. And when should a brand approach a PR agency? Like at what point, is there a specific point where you're like, okay, cool, they're getting to a certain revenue or a certain amount of followers, or at what point do you think they really need to make the switch to having a dedicated PR agency?
Good question. I think it varies because you could work, you don't necessarily need a full-on agency. You may just need a freelancer who has relationships with media outlets that you want to focus on, or someone who's just an expert in social media. So I think depending on the budget, which of course is going to be scalable, you might want to start small with just a freelancer. And then from there, once you're seeing results and there's interest and you're seeing the revenue start to come in, then you can start to expand to a larger agency. That said, there are some small agencies that focus on startups. So they'll work with you if you have a smaller budget. That's part of it. I think they view it as an opportunity as well, because if they believe in your brand, they're thinking, okay, you're going to grow, we're going to grow with you. So there's going to be, again, that relationship built with some of those smaller agencies who focus on startups, because they want to grow with you. They want to see you grow, and they want to be part of that journey. Versus if you go to larger agencies, you're obviously going to be paying quite a bit more. But I think part of it's just going to be how your seeing your performance evolve and increase, starting small and then kind of growing with that.
Awesome. That's also great. I think people are absolutely not thinking even of a freelancer or PR person that might have these contacts that people have a really hard time finding, or maybe not having time to find on their own, and then they can grow from there, or partner up with a smaller agency.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
And how would someone look for a reputable freelance PR person? Because I think that's something that, I know that I work with a lot of startups, and that's something that they look for sometimes and they don't know where to go.
Yeah, good question. I think I don't know the names of it, but I know there's tools. I'll have to follow up. I can probably follow up with you, maybe with a link of where you
Sure.
can go for like a
Yeah.
freelance network, but a lot of it's word of mouth
Uh-huh.
sometimes. Like, so even we've had situations where a smaller brand will come to us and be interested in a conversation. We know we couldn't service their business because of a budget threshold. So we have actual freelancers that we work with now that we bring in that we can say, hey, we can't do this, but we have some influencers that we can send your way, Even me personally, I'll talk to folks who are like, I'm interested in PR. Do you know anyone? And then I know folks who can help with the business. So a lot of it is word of mouth. But I'm sure there's a network or some sort of tool that allows people to search for freelancers.
Great, great. And can you share like some examples of like successful PR campaigns for emerging beauty brands and what made these campaigns stand out and gain traction?
I don't know if you've heard of Beekman 1802.
Which one is it called?
Beekman
Beekman.
1802.
Oh no.
Basically, they launched a new potato enzyme based product and brought on Mrs. Potato Head as the spokesperson.
Oh
That
my
was
God.
brilliant. That was like a brand that most people
Oh,
have
I
never
have
heard of.
heard about this.
They blew
Yeah.
up. And that's a good
Yeah.
example of like a smaller brand who knows they have to break through and they took a risk. Like that is something that we might propose to a lot of our brands and they wouldn't want to do it. They wouldn't see the connect. They would think it's getting too far away from the science, because a lot of the bigger brands are afraid to take that risk and are so set in what they've done traditionally, where smaller brands and startups can take a risk like that. And I think that's a great example of just small brand that made a big wave within the industry. That's one great example. And I would say also looking at bigger brands and outside of the beauty industry to come up with something that can break through for your brand, for a startup specifically. I feel like the benefit of a startup is you don't have the same traditional way of doing things necessarily. So you can explore different ways of operating. You can look to the bigger brands to get inspiration from them. You can look at some of the smaller brands. You can take more of a risk. I think that's super important. I would also say, just again, going back to trends, that just understanding the trends happening right now. I will tell you, I was just reading about just some of the bigger trends that are happening in 2024. And nostalgia is going to continue to be one of them. And I think the combination of nostalgia and innovation, you're going to start to see those things kind of bridge. So like, how do you bring back something old, but make it relevant for a new generation? So even bringing back your old mascots or creating a new mascot that reminds people of what an old mascot would have been. So anything you can tap into there as a new brand, I think will be successful. And also just this idea of, one thing that we talk about a lot is like this idea of joy and enjoyment. That's another big thing people want right now, because people are feeling fatigue from social media, and we're going into a heavy political climate. We know what it's going to be. We know who's running. We know what the next few years or the year, hopefully the section is going to look like. It's going to be a lot of heaviness. And so people are looking for some sort of escape. They want something to feel good about. So I think that's something that startups can tap into as well. Thinking about how can they give people that good feeling, that nostalgic feeling, even if they're a new brand. How do you tap into something that gives that comfort, and matching it with innovation and something that's new? So packaging it up in a new way. I think that's where you'll see a lot of brands playing. So it's a great opportunity for startups.
I love that viewpoint. It's like the world is what it is right now, and like we don't really see it lightening up anytime soon. But the beauty in especially newer brands being able to bring something beautiful and fresh into the world that interjects something awesome into someone's day, like that's so powerful. And I love that.
That's a great brand story right there. Can you start a new product now? And just there you go.
So Richard, a second ago, you mentioned that you're always looking at the trends and you said Google trends and you mentioned TikTok trends earlier in our conversation. How do people search for the trends?
Google one, TikTok, just directly searching on TikTok. I would say you can look at everything from aesthetic to beauty and get a sense of what are those hashtags being used. I think that's one first step. Again, if you have the budget, there are tools that will help you with that. So there are certain tools like a Spate, for instance, that actually does that for you. So it was created for the beauty industry, and it actually captures the top Google trends within beauty, the top TikTok trends, which is something that they just started rolling out, but it shows you what's trending, what are the ingredients that are trending within the industry, what are the top hashtags within the industry and driving the conversation right now. So it brings all that in for you. It's all, again, based on Google search, so you can do it manually as well. A lot of it is just Googling random things, to be honest. Like that's what I do quite a bit. I'm like, oh, what's happening here? And then it leads me into some rabbit hole to some extent where I'm like, oh, I just discovered something new. But I think even the aesthetic piece is important. So that's something that I think is not going to go away anytime soon. It's like all these micro communities on TikTok creating these aesthetics, and then that blows up into something. As I shared with the Hailey Bieber example, more brands are going to lean into that to create a trend and kind of precede that trend as a way to launch their product. So I think there's no right way to search those trends when you're using a search function. But on the flip side, there are other tools that actually capture those trends for you. So I was saying before, I was using Mintel as one of the tools we use to look at some of the macro trends or the trend predictions for 2024. That's where I saw about the idea of nostalgia still being super relevant and matching it with innovation. So that's something I think is important just to make sure. I think this role like a PR has not been seen as like, oh, we're so up on the macro trends and we know all the data. Now is the time for us to lean into that as well to inform what we do. So that's an example, and also understanding how those trends are being relayed in earned media as well. So a lot of times you see something blowing up on TikTok, but then you're like, is it really resonating? Are people writing about this, or vice versa? So some of those trends you see, they start to trickle down to media. And what we're learning is editors get the same data that we have access to. So when they want to write a story, they want to know what their consumers are thinking about, what they care about. So they're looking at the trends, they're seeing what's happening on Google search and everything else, and creating their stories accordingly. So they know. I went to an editor dinner recently, and I brought up the Snell. I don't know if you've heard the Snell skincare trend.
Oh yeah, yep.
So that came up, and I was like, so how did you find out? Like, how did you start writing about this? And she was like, actually, I saw a Google alert, and it was talking about this, how people are searching for this. And then she remembered that it was a big thing, like I guess early 2000. And
In
so
the
she said, with the
90s,
data
even
I
in the
saw,
90s,
yeah, it's
yes.
like which I didn't know. I didn't know this was a thing that had come back. So she was like, "Oh, I saw the data, then I remembered something, and that prompted my story." So I think what a lot of PR teams should do, and especially for startups, is again keeping track of that data and using that to inform how you reach out to media as well. If you can say, like, I'm launching this new product that's uses this Snell ingredient, which has seen a 400% increase in Google search, that'll pique their interest. They're like, oh, wait, what's happening now? There's a stat. Or if you show that there's a hashtag trending on TikTok that you can tie your product to and send that to an editor, that gets their attention, because that means their readers want to know about this as well. So TikTok is definitely a place where trends are starting and being picked up from an editorial standpoint as well.
Wow, that is very interesting. And it also shows you how you really need to be at the forefront. Like you have to be noticing these trends, picking it up. Like PR can be a very fast moving industry, it sounds like, which I had never really thought of that much before. I definitely got the long-term thing, but this is like, it sounds like with TikTok and all Instagram reels and all these different things, it makes it actually very fast moving, especially when you're tying it into media and all this kind of stuff to make your product as relevant as humanly possible.
Absolutely. And I think to that point, because of TikTok and other social media platforms, trends come and go. So
Yeah.
that's the importance of acting fast. And so what we've been trying to do is like, how do we get ahead of the trends? So like there's a predictive analytics piece to it. We're like, okay, is this going to keep going? Where are we with this trend? Do we have an opportunity to still get involved? Are we too late? Can we be the first to hop on this trend? So those all come into play. And perfect example, I just saw on TikTok, there was Gen Z's having this large conversation about aging. Apparently Gen Z is very much afraid of aging. So that's become a big conversation on TikTok. And it came up that they're calling it like aging like milk. And so my first thought is if you're a milk brand, this is something you can jump in. Milk actually has anti-aging benefits. So you could actually flip that on its head and say, actually drink milk because it will help you look. So it's like just thinking, finding those things. And like, literally, I was like telling everyone, I was like, is anyone working on this brand? Now's the time to jump on it. Now's the time. No taker. But that's the sort of mentality we're trying to fuse across our teams is like, think about that and don't, I think the initial reaction is, oh, but we don't want to be involved in that. It's kind of a negative conversation, but how do you flip it? Like it's
Yeah.
a relevant thing. How can you get involved in a way that's going to make it a positive and work out for your brand and make you seem relevant specifically for that audience? So one example of how you can jump on something quickly.
Amazing. I love this. These are great stories. I love it.
Super interesting. And then even just the idea that like at some point you guys could be making the trends, right? So,
Exactly. That's
you know,
typically the hope.
do you have any advice on creating engaging social media content?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the trends as well. I think you have to be so ingrained in what the trends are on TikTok and create your content accordingly. And I think kind of what you said, I think there was a time where most brands wanted to start the trend, but I do think they're trying to back away from that. And they're like, we just want to be part of the trend conversation and enable the trend once it's spotted because things have evolved to where you have all these influencers who start trends now. So now it's like, how can we be part of it and be part of those conversations more so than how do we start it? I think that's a big piece of it. Creativity plays a big role. So to your point, if there is a trend, it takes a lot of brain power to think about how can we fit within this. So as an example, I just learned about a trend of apparently there's a trend where you take an orange and you present it to your friend or your partner and you don't say a word, you just hold it in front of them to see what they do. If they peel the orange, that's a green flag. If they don't, it's a red flag. That randomly has become a thing. So so that's an example of a trend that
Wow.
you might think, what would this do with beauty? But you can actually tap into that. What happens if you take your beauty product and give it to someone? Maybe you have a jingle and you sing half the jingle, give them the product, you pause, and then see if they pick up on it. That's one example, but how can you make that trend relevant for your brand in an interesting way? So it's like that's kind of the thought process I think startups should really lean into. Don't necessarily try to start the trend. Think about what trends can work for you. And also don't be afraid to let influencers lead that for you. I think that's also kind of scary for some brands. It's like you're used to creating your content and having a vision and wanting to live into this. Sometimes it works better when you just hand it to an influencer and say, hey, here's some guardrails, got to stay within these parameters, but do whatever you think makes sense with this, knowing that's where I think the importance of targeting the right influencers. You want those who lean into trends or have conversations that make sense for your brand to where you feel comfortable giving them your product and letting them just go with it.
Wow. So there's so much to think about here. And I guess like what I'm hearing a lot is around TikTok, but I wouldn't say like all of the demographics are on TikTok, right? So what about some of the other platforms and what are you seeing as far as trends in those other platforms and how does this, can you talk a little bit more about how it translates to other demographics besides TikTok users?
Definitely. I think, well, I'll start with TikTok has become so important because to your point, it's reaching that younger audience, but you're also seeing the older audience get involved. Not as actively involved, but they're getting fed content from TikTok. That's become the thing. I like, even me, I got like 10 TikTok texts just yesterday from random people like, I saw this on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, like personally. So, but I still get fed that information. So I think that's why TikTok has kind of become the main social media platform, especially for beauty, because there's just so much going on. And it's also the algorithm is made to help promote individual content and great content. it still doesn't work out necessarily in a brand's favor because they want it to be very much influencer and people led. I think that's why it's become kind of the go-to at this point. I think most of the trends across, I would say, in Instagram, for instance, have remained the same. I think it's still kind of what are the trends. I don't think it deviates too much from TikTok generally, but I will say if a traditional PR brand probably would have more of an ad approach on Instagram versus the free do whatever you want here and lean into these trends. I think that's kind of my assessment is like Instagram's still relatively a bit more traditional from we're going to do this post, making an ad or do this story versus the free for all and like hands-off approach that you might take on a TikTok. From a different demographic standpoint, if you're trying to reach an older audience, I think TikTok probably would be the place to go for that slightly older above Gen Z audience. But I still think they're migrating over to TikTok as well. Even when if you think about the trajectory, it was like Facebook first, that's where all the young folks were. Then it was, okay, now all the young folks are on Instagram, but then some people stayed on Facebook, but there are a lot of folks who then went to Instagram. Same thing's happening with TikTok. It's like now everybody wants to be on TikTok. It's starting with the young folks. Soon older folks are going to continually move over, and then there's probably going to be a new platform at that point. So it's like a
When are you getting on there, Richard?
I'm like, I'm the person who stopped at Instagram. I was like, you know what? I'm good. Just text me anything you need me to say.
Well, and there's a lot of things that come over from TikTok onto Instagram, so you still end up
Exactly.
seeing a lot of that
Yeah.
stuff. And,
As the slightly older demographic, we get all the TikToks a week later, you know?
Exactly.
right,
People behind.
exactly. So yeah, I mean, I am on TikTok, but not personally. My business is on TikTok, but I'm not as active on there as I should be.
It's a good one for trends. Definitely where
You
you want to be.
definitely convinced me to check it out more. I have it on my phone for the same reason you mentioned. Like people send me TikToks, and then also I finally downloaded it to be able to look at what they're sending me, not in the browser. But now I'm like, man, I really need to use that more as a tool to see what other brands in the space are doing, even though I'm not necessarily involved in ad creation or anything like that. But just as far as design, staying relevant, I think that's a great advice, honestly, for almost anyone that's involved in anything brand related in order to stay on top of the news.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I need to spend more time on there. I just don't want to get sucked in because
Oh, you
the
will.
algorithm is so good
You
that
will.
get sucked in. Like the folks that work with me, some of my freelancers, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't get off of it. I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to be that person either. So yeah, it's addictive. So
But this has been a really, really cool way and a new way of kind of looking at social media. I definitely resonate with a lot of the things you're saying. It's very inspiring to listen to your story.
Oh, well, thank you. Glad to share.
yeah, thank you
Absolutely,
so much for
absolutely.
being here, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll wrap up unless you have any other tools or anything else you want to share before we say our
The only that I'll leave you with specifically for startups, I think this is going to be important. I would say think about diversity from the start. And I think that's a shift we're seeing as well. We're starting to see a lot of brands made grand statements over the last couple of years that they can't live up to. So people are recognizing that now. So I would say think about diversity, not you don't have to do something grand or it doesn't even need to be charitable, but have that representation within what you're doing. I think it's easier than ever to do that and make that part of your brand DNA from the start by working with a variety of influencers and like just showing that representation. I think it's going to be super important from the very beginning. So you're not in a situation where you have to address it down the road, especially if you grow and become a big brand and people look back and don't see that. I think that would be a bit of advice I would give to any startup at this point. So that's the last piece of advice
I think that's
Cool.
fantastic advice.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Richard.
Of course.
And that wraps up another episode of Entrepreneur Mind Speak. We'll see you on our next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.